Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a palette of grayscale values that we're going to use to paint this apple. Put your opacity up to 100%, and we're going to pick a mid-tone gray, so with no saturation. So we're selecting from the far left. We'll paint a mid-tone gray. We'll paint something close to black and something close to white. And then we can easily select those colors while we're on the brush by holding down the Alt key. That brings up the color picker, and we can just click to select those values. Now the first thing we're going to do is paint the entire apple in with our mid-tone. Now you could just paint this in manually, there's nothing wrong with that, or you could use a selection. So if you take the magic wand tool, go to the layer that has the line art on it and click on the outside of the apple, it should select everything around it. For some reason it didn't select a little area here, so I'm just going to paint over that. And then invert your selection, and you can fill the apple with your foreground color. Do that by right-clicking inside the selection, go to Fill Selection, and then make sure Foreground Color is selected. Oh, remember to select a new layer for that. Don't put it on the same layer as the line art. So now we have our base color down, and we can still see the line art because the line art is set to a blend mode that allows it to be seen over top. So now we're going to begin with the actual painting. First, we're going to make a new layer and call it Shadows. And we're going to make it a clipping mask. Hold Alt and move the cursor in between the two layers until the little box appears, and then click. This means that nothing that we paint on this layer can go outside the boundaries of the gray midtone we've put on. So make sure that you have your brush tool selected with a soft-edged brush and the opacity somewhere in the 20%, 24, 25% is a good value here. So now you're going to start painting in the areas that are darker than the average value. So look at the reference picture of the apple and look for the areas that are dark. Because your brush is set to a low opacity, it sets down its color in layers. The first layer is very transparent. As you put more layers over top by clicking and stroking over the same area multiple times, the color builds up. In this case, it's a black value, so the black becomes darker the more times you click and paint over the same area. This can take some getting used to, so don't worry if it feels a little awkward at first. We're just blocking in very rough areas of value at this point. You don't have to worry about being exact. You just want to try to match the basic areas of shadow in your reference picture. One thing you could do to make this a little easier is to take the reference picture of the apple and actually go up to Enhance and change it to black and white so that you can see exactly what the values are and you don't get distracted by the color. I didn't do this until the end in this tutorial, but there's no reason you can't start off that way. Now you notice that because your brush is set at a low opacity, you are creating a large range of values as you paint the dark areas in. So one thing that you can do is hold Alt and select one of the new darker grays that you've created and then paint over areas with that. You can use that to lighten areas that you've accidentally made too dark, or to help blend areas where the light and dark has too much contrast. By sampling these new grays, you can create an even wider range of values. You can see at this point that there's not very much of the original base value left. Okay, once you've got your dark areas placed, we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this one Highlights. Make sure you also set this to be a clipping mask. Now you're going to select the light color from our palette, and we're going to do the same thing we did before, except this time we're going to try to paint in the bright areas, the areas that are brighter than the average value on our reference picture. We're only worried about really large or distinct areas right now. So don't worry about things like the little dots in the texture or the streaks in the skin. That's not something we worry about at this stage. I'm actually going to sample the pure white of the background here just to brighten that one highlight up even more. Now, because we put the highlights on a separate layer, we can adjust them independently of the shadows. So we can switch to our eraser tool and put the opacity quite low on this, and so you can erase just in little increments. You can partially erase parts to soften up edges or to make things just less bright. An opacity of 20% will just remove a small amount of white, but won't remove it entirely. So we're just going to finish putting in some more highlight areas here. Just keep looking at your reference picture, and anywhere that it seems lighter than average, you'll put a little bit of highlights into your highlight layer. And just like with the shadows, when you put your highlights on there, you'll start creating a range of lighter values. So you can always sample those lighter values if you want something that's not quite as bright to help blend edges or just to match the values that you see in your reference picture. So at this point I go back to the shadow layer and try to make a few adjustments on the shadows, but one thing you'll notice is because the shadow layer is below the highlight layer, I can't do anything that changes the highlights. I can't paint over top of them, I can't smooth any of their edges. And so at this point, what I usually like to do is to create a new layer on top of the highlights and call it details. And this is where we're going to put both shadows and highlights, just to sort of add more detail to our values and sort of fine-tune the areas that we've already created. Make sure this layer is a clipping mask as well. And so in this detail layer, we're going to take a look at each highlight and each shadow area and just check to make sure it matches our reference picture. So there's a few lines up at the top here that I'm going to make thinner. There's going to be some areas that I will blend in a little more and maybe get a little bit more specific with the shapes of some of the areas. But this is a time for you to just really take a look at the basic shadows and highlights you've added and see if there's things you can do to refine them and make them more accurate. You'll usually start using a smaller brush at this stage, and you may want to zoom in a little bit as well so that you can see things in more detail. You'll notice that I'm doing all my sampling from the actual object itself now. I'm not using the palette anymore. That's because there's enough values on the object that I have a lot to choose from now. This phase can go on for as long as you want. You can keep going and refining the values until you're happy with them, or until you just run out of time. But this stage, known as the refining stage or the details stage, is where you will spend the bulk of your time. So by turning the detail layer on and off, you can see what a difference it makes. Now this was the point in the process where I changed the reference picture to black and white, and one thing I noticed right away was that the values on the apple were actually not as dark as I had painted them in. And so I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer and just shift the values a little bit so that it matches my reference picture. So those values are much more accurate now, although it did lighten everything so much that I want to go back in and add a couple small dark areas. And one thing I did here by accident was I left my palette on a layer that is under the adjustment layer, so it's actually lightened up my entire palette. So I actually have to go back and reselect a darker color. It's probably a good idea to keep your palette on a separate layer somewhere so it doesn't get affected by things like that. So now that the levels have shifted everything to be a little brighter, I'm just going to go back in and add just a few of the really dark darks from my reference picture. Now, I was using a hard-edged brush at this point, and I think a few of those lines just have edges that are a little bit too sharp. So I'm just going to go in and hit them with the blur tool a little bit and soften them up. The very last step here was to smooth the edges of the apple itself, because whenever you fill a selection, the edges can get a little jagged. I wouldn't recommend using the blur tool here because you don't want the edges to be too fuzzy. Instead, I would turn off your shadow, your highlight, your detail layers until you can see only the base flat color that we put in. Select that color, and then with just a regular hard-edged brush, you can sort of paint over the edges a little bit just to smooth them out. So now it's time to add color. So we're going to go back to the remaining color apple, select that layer, hold down Alt and click and drag, and it'll create a new image. We'll just drag it right up over top. So now we're going to create a new layer on top and make it a clipping mask. And go to your brush tool. Select sort of a base color of the apple, just a default red. And with your brush set to 100% opacity, we're just going to paint the entire apple, or at least all of the red parts. Leave an area for the stem. Switch to a hard edge brush and paint right up to the stem, but not over top of it. We're going to do the stem on its own layer. Now we're going to pick a different blend mode for this layer so that you can see the values behind the color. And the blend mode we're going to use is overlay. So with that blend mode selected, we can see all of our highlights and shadows that we put on earlier. Now that's pretty effective, and we're pretty close to being done. But most objects are not a single flat color. You can see over in the corner here that the apple's a little bit more peachy, so we're just going to grab a little bit of that color by holding Alt and clicking on it. Make sure you're going back to a soft edge brush and a very low opacity. And we're just going to paint onto that same layer a little bit of that peach color, just so there's some variation. Just adding a little variety to the color here and there can really make things look a lot more realistic. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing with a little bit of the green color from around the stem. So I'm going to make a new layer for the stem and just select or sample the colors from your reference picture and start painting them on. Again, don't forget to make it a clipping mask so you can't go outside the lines. And once you've got the sampled colors painted in, you can change this layer to overlay as well. So this is now looking reasonably good, and we could call it finished at this stage. It just depends how detailed and refined you want your final piece to be. I'm going to do a few adjustments to this. There's some areas that I feel look a little bit too bright compared to the original. So I'm going to sample some color directly from the original apple. And on a new layer with a very low opacity, I'm just going to paint a little bit of that color over those spots to darken them up a bit. Again, we could end it at this stage and be satisfied with it. But I'm going to show you how to create those little dots, the texture on the apple, because it will introduce us to a couple new brush tools. So first I'm going to sample the color of those little spots, and then we're going to pick a brush size that is about the same size as the dots. We're going to put the opacity up because we don't want to have to click on the same area more than once, but not to 100%, so a little bit of the base color can still show through. Now we could just click and put these in individually by hand, but that's slow and often doesn't look very natural. Instead, we're going to go to the brush settings window. Now you can do a lot of things to how the brush looks here, but there's two that are going to be useful in this case. The first is the scatter slider. You'll notice as you move that up, you can see that the brush is going to kind of scatter dots instead of having them all together on a single line. So at the moment the brush would look like this, which isn't quite what we want. The second one we want to change is the spacing. And the higher we put that slider up, the fewer dots will be drawn as we move the brush around. So on a new layer, we're going to draw over top of the apple, and you can see that it's spreading dots around kind of randomly. Now, I actually don't like these settings because the dots are getting kind of clumped together, so I'm going to adjust them slightly. You can see now in the little preview window that these look a lot more spread out. And that looks a little bit better. So I'm just going to spread those around the apple. And then, because the spots on the original apple have a very soft edge to them, I'm just going to go over those spots with the blur tool. Now at the moment the spots don't look quite right because you can see in the original apple they don't show up in the highlight and mine do. So we're going to change the blending mode here. You can try either lighten or screen. Those are two modes that make the layer lighten whatever's below it. So at this point I just reduce the opacity a little bit, and then actually with a smaller brush go in and add just a few of the smaller dots near the bottom of the apple. And like I said, you could continue with this for as long as you're happy to, this refinement stage, but I think this is pretty good and we're going to leave it there. So when you're finished with your apple, make sure you save it as exercise 3.